18 years old, standing on a rotting wooden platform in the scorching midday sun, surrounded by the icy stares of those haggling over a human being as if buying a horse. Eliza Vance didn't cry. Her tears had dried up the night before, when her own uncle signed the papers selling her off to pay off his gambling debts. This is Black Hollow, where justice doesn't exist, and a young girl is only worth the highest price someone is willing to pay. This story will make you angry, heartbroken, and ultimately, it will make you believe that humans can still choose to do the right thing. Like now, comment the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The hammer was already in the auctioneer's hand when Eliza Vance understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, that no one was coming to save her. She had spent the better part of the morning telling herself otherwise, telling herself that there had been some mistake, that the paperwork her Uncle Gerald had signed in the back room of the Broken Spur Saloon was not legally binding, that a man could not simply sell his niece the way he might sell a mule or a parcel of land gone sour. She had told herself these things while they walked her from the holding room behind the feed store, while they made her stand on the platform in the center of Black Hollow's main street, while the crowd gathered and the bidders pulled out their money purses and the auctioneer straightened his collar and licked the end of his pencil like this was just another Tuesday. She had stopped telling herself those things about 10 minutes ago. The platform was not much, rough-cut pine boards nailed together in a hurry, standing maybe 2 feet off the packed dirt of the street. The kind of thing you could build in an afternoon and tear down just as fast, which she suspected was the point. There were 3 other women up there with her. One was maybe 30, with a split lip that had not quite healed and eyes that had learned not to look at anything directly. The other 2 were younger, one clutching the sleeve of the other, both of them staring at the boards under their feet. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The crowd below was maybe 60 people, give or take. Some of them Eliza recognized. She had been in Black Hollow for nearly 3 weeks, long enough to learn faces if not names. She recognized the man who ran the dry goods store, standing near the back with his hat pulled low. She recognized one of the deputies, a heavy-set man named Cutter, who wore his badge slightly crooked and who had been the one to escort her out of the jail cell that morning when they decided she was ready to go to the platform. She recognized 2 ranchers from east of town who had been pointed out to her as men who owned substantial acreage and who were, according to her uncle, men of considerable standing. They were all here. They were all watching. Some of them looked uncomfortable. Most of them did not look uncomfortable enough to actually do anything about it, which Eliza was beginning to understand was the defining characteristic of this town. "Next lot," said the auctioneer. His name was Pruitt. He was a thin man with a thin mustache and the particular kind of cheerfulness that sits on top of something dead. He had a ledger book open in one hand and the hammer in the other, and he spoke in the practiced sing-song of a man who had done this many times before and had long since made his peace with it, or had never needed to. Eliza Vance, 18 years of age, in good health, able-bodied, literate. He paused to look up from the ledger. "Literate's a selling point, boys. Don't see that every day out here." There was a murmur through the crowd, a few chuckles from men who thought that was funny. Eliza looked out over the street, beyond the crowd, beyond the hitching posts and the water trough, and the front of the Broken Spur with its peeling paint. The land just stretched away flat and brown and enormous under a sky that didn't care about any of this. She had grown up in Ohio, in a house with glass windows and a vegetable garden her mother had kept every year until she died. And sometimes Eliza still woke up in the morning expecting to hear her mother moving around downstairs, and it took a few seconds before she remembered all the things that had happened since then and the sequence by which she had ended up here. Her father had died of fever when she was 14. Her mother had lasted another 2 years before the grief finished what the hard winters had started. With no other family Eliza had known about, she'd gone to live with her Uncle Gerald Vance, her father's older brother, who had a small trading operation in Missouri and who had seemed, at first impression, like a man who was simply careless rather than a man who was dangerous. That distinction had taken her a while to appreciate. Gerald Vance was not malicious in any organized way. He did not plan cruelties. He simply moved through the world as though the convenience of other people was an optional feature. And when his gambling debts accumulated past a point he could ignore, He had sat down with representatives of the Harlow Syndicate and worked out an arrangement that settled his accounts and left his conscience, apparently, in a condition he could live with. She had found out about it the night before. He had come to her room. She had been sleeping in a boarding house, the two of them sharing space while Gerald supposedly negotiated some trading contract or other, and he had sat on the edge of the chair by the window and explained it to her in the same tone he used to explain everything, which was the tone of a man narrating a situation that had unfortunately come about through no particular fault of his own. "You'll be placed with a household," he had said. "Could be worse things. Could be a lot worse things." She had thrown a water pitcher at him and missed, and then two men she had never seen before had come through the door, and that had been the end of the conversation. She had spent the night in a cell behind the marshal's office. The marshal himself had never appeared. Deputy Cutter had slid a tin plate of beans under the door around supper time and told her to quit rattling the bars, or he'd have to find a way to discourage that. She had not slept. She had spent the night sitting on the wooden cot trying to think through every possible option, and by the time the gray light started coming under the door, she had identified approximately 0 options that she could carry out from inside a locked cell with no tools, no money, no horse, and nobody in the town who had any particular reason to help her. And now here she was. "Opening bid," said Pruitt. $200. A hand went up somewhere to her left. She didn't look. $250. Another hand. She was looking at a water stain on the front of the feed store across the street. It was roughly the shape of a dog sitting down. She was looking at that instead of the people bidding on her because it seemed like the thing most likely to keep her functional for whatever came next. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision sometime around 3 in the morning, and she was going to hold to it, because crying would not help anything, and would only give satisfaction to people who did not deserve satisfaction. 300. 350. 400 from the gentleman in the back. She heard a voice she half recognized. One of the ranchers, she thought. The one with the gray beard who had been pointed out to her at some point. Say, 450. Pruitt noted it in his ledger. $450. Do I hear 5? The crowd had gotten quieter. When the number got up this high, the casual observer stopped talking and started watching. Eliza was aware of the attention the way you are aware of a smell. Not looking at it directly, but knowing it was there. She had been trying, in the back of her mind, to calculate what her options were once she was purchased. Whether whoever bought her would keep her in town or take her somewhere else. Whether there would be any moment in the handoff or the transport where something could be done. She did not know what that something might be. She just knew that as long as she was breathing and thinking, something was not 0. $450 going once, said Pruitt. A pause. Going twice. 500. The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it was not a voice she recognized. The crowd shifted, people turned. There was that particular ripple that moves through a group of people when something unexpected happens. Not panic, not alarm, just the animal awareness that something has changed. Eliza looked up. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was tall, and the first thing she noticed about him was not his face but the way he stood, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time in places where sudden movement could get you killed. He was wearing trail dust on everything, which meant he had ridden in recently or had ridden in fast. His hat was pulled down but not low enough to hide his face, and his face was the kind of face that had been rearranged by weather and circumstance into something that was difficult to read and not especially inviting to try. He had dark eyes. He was watching Pruitt with those dark eyes in a way that made Pruitt stop licking his pencil. $500, the man said again, as if clarifying for anyone who had missed it. There was a murmur. Not the murmur of amusement from before, a different kind. Lower. More careful. That's, Pruitt shuffled his papers. That's a serious bid, sir. You prepared to back that up? I generally don't say things I'm not prepared to back up. More murmuring. The gray-bearded rancher who had been bidding craned his neck to look at the newcomer, and something passed across his face that Eliza could not quite name. Wariness, maybe. Calculation. Do I hear 550? Pruitt asked. No one moved. The gray-bearded rancher looked at the man in the back for a moment longer, then looked away and did not raise his hand. 500 going once, Pruitt said, with less showmanship than before. Going twice. The hammer came down. The sound of it was surprisingly small, just a tap of wood on wood. The crowd started talking again, quieter than before, people angling away from each other in that sideways way that meant nobody wanted to be seen discussing the thing they were all thinking about. Pruitt wrote something in his ledger and did not look up. Eliza looked at the man who had just bought her. He was already looking at her. They took her off the platform through a side door that led into the feed store. A courtesy, she supposed, or a habit. Some procedural afterthought designed to move the merchandise efficiently rather than parade it back through the crowd. The woman with the split lip went one way. The two younger women went another, both of them still not speaking, still holding on to each other. Eliza was steered into a room at the back of the feed store by Deputy Cutter's hand on her elbow, and she went without fighting because fighting now was going to accomplish nothing except bruising her arm and making Cutter feel like he'd done something productive. The room smelled like burlap and mouse droppings. There was a table with a lantern on it, unlit, and two chairs that looked like they had been there since the building was built and had not been sat in with any regularity since. The window was high on the wall and covered with a piece of sacking. She stood in the middle of the room and waited. Cutter leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded and watched her in a way that was meant to be intimidating but mostly just looked tired. He was a man who was not comfortable with silence. She had figured that out in the jail cell, and after about 2 minutes of it, he said, "You'd be smart to just go easy." "Is that your advice?" Eliza said. It was not really a question. "I'm just saying, man who bought you's got a reputation. You don't want to make it harder than it needs to be." "What reputation?" Cutter looked at her. "You don't know who that was?" "I've been in Black Hollow 3 weeks. I don't know a lot of people." He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "Rhett Maddox." She waited for more. When it didn't come, she said, "That's supposed to mean something to me." "It means something to everybody else in that room," Cutter said. "It means something to the graybeard who was bidding against him and then very suddenly wasn't." He shrugged with one shoulder. "Man's a gunslinger. Done work for the syndicate in the past and done work against people the syndicate didn't like. Now word is he's done some things the syndicate doesn't like, and nobody's quite sure which way that's going to go." He looked at her. "All I'm saying is whatever he wants you for, your best play is to not give him reasons to be annoyed." "Thank you," Eliza said. "That's very helpful." Cutter heard the flatness in her voice and opened his mouth to say something, and then the door at the other end of the room opened and Rhett Maddox walked in. Up close, he was older than he had seemed from the platform, mid-30s maybe, though it was hard to tell with certainty because the kind of life that put that expression on a man's face tended to add years that were not chronological. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. His nose had been broken at some point and had healed slightly off-center. There was a scar running along his jaw that disappeared into the short stubble on his chin. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt, were scarred too. The knuckles, the web of skin between thumb and forefinger. He looked at Cutter. "Get out." Cutter straightened up from the doorframe. "Now hold on, the protocol is—" "I just paid $500, Maddox said. "What I bought doesn't include you standing in my room. Get out." There was a moment where Cutter appeared to consider whether this was worth arguing about, and then decided it wasn't, and then left. The door closed behind him. The room was quiet, except for the muffled noise of the street outside. Maddox looked at her. She looked at him. "So," she said. "So," he said. "Am I supposed to be frightened?" "I don't know what you're supposed to be," he said. He walked to one of the chairs and sat down in it, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to remain standing in the way that people who are trying to establish authority tend to remain standing. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the unlit lantern for a moment. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to decide for yourself whether to believe it, because I can't make you believe anything, and I'm not going to try." She waited. "I didn't buy you to keep you," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like. I did not buy you for whatever you're thinking I bought you for." He looked up at her. "I bought you because the alternative was that man with the gray beard buying you, and I know what he does with the women the syndicate places in his household, and I'm not interested in that being your situation." She studied him. She was good at reading people. She had always been good at it, and the past few weeks had sharpened the skill considerably out of necessity. He did not look like a man performing honesty. He looked like a man who was tired and was stating a fact. "You could be lying," she said. "I could be," he agreed. "If I am, you'll find out soon enough, and you'll have lost nothing by listening first." "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse moved past the building. The sound of its hooves on the packed dirt came through the wall and faded. "I've been trying to get at the Harlow Syndicate for 2 years," he said. "They run this territory like they own it, because they mostly do own it. The auction you just stood up on, that's one operation out of a dozen they've got running. Land theft, protection rackets, moving people the way they move cattle." He paused. "I've got pieces of it, not enough. To do anything real, I'd need documentation. Their books? They keep ledgers. Detailed ones, because the men running this aren't idiots, they're businessmen, and businessmen keep records of their business. Those records are locked in the back office of the building they operate out of on Deacon Street. I need to get to them." She was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you have a decision to make," he said. "I can put you on a horse right now and point you toward the nearest town that's not under syndicate control. And you can start from there and figure out your life. That's one option." He paused again. "Or you help me. Help you get into the syndicate's building. Help me get evidence that takes them down." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 2 girls on the platform who had not spoken. She thought about the woman with the split lip. She thought about the gray-bearded rancher who had been bidding on her, and had stopped bidding only when this man had set a number that the rancher was apparently not willing to challenge. She thought about Deputy Cutter and his badge worn slightly crooked and his advice to go easy. "What do you know about my uncle's dealings with them?" she said. Something shifted in Maddox's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "Some," he said. "Tell me what you know." He told her. It took about 10 minutes. While he talked, she sat in the other chair and listened, and some of it she had known, and some of it she had not. And by the time he finished, she had a clearer picture of the last 3 weeks of her life and how they had fit together. And the picture was not pleasant, but it was at least coherent. "My uncle kept records too," she said when he finished. He looked at her. "He's a careful man when it comes to money, even when it's money he shouldn't have. He always wrote things down, dates, amounts, names, everything. He said it was insurance." She paused. "I don't know where he keeps it now, but I know the system he uses. If his papers ended up in the syndicate's records, either because they took them or because he handed them over as part of the arrangement, I might be able to help you find what you're looking for faster than you could find it alone." Maddox was watching her with those dark eyes. "You'd do that." "I'd do that," she said, "for reasons that have nothing to do with helping you." "Fair enough," he said. She stood up from the chair. Her legs were stiff from the platform and the night in the cell before that, but she stood up straight and she looked at him levelly. "One more thing," she said. "What?" "If at any point I decide you're not what you're presenting yourself as, I will not go quietly. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "I figured," and that, more than anything else, was what made her decide to trust him enough to try. They left through the back of the feed store while the front was still occupied with the dispersal of the crowd. Maddox had a horse at the rail on the alley side. A big gray with mud on its legs and a disposition that suggested it had been ridden hard and was privately irritated about that. And he gave Eliza a leg up and then swung up behind her without ceremony, and they moved out of the alley and through the back streets of Black Hollow at a walk that was designed not to attract attention. She had been in the town long enough to have a rough map of it in her head. It was not a large place, maybe 300 people, more in the summer when the trail crews came through, and Black Hollow existed for a particular purpose that had nothing to do with the official story of it being a supply depot and regional trade center. The official story was that it had grown up around a natural water source and a crossing point on the river to the east, and that the Harlow Syndicate had simply had the foresight to invest in its development. The unofficial story, as Eliza had been piecing it together from overheard conversations and things her uncle had let slip, was that the Harlow Syndicate had more or less created Black Hollow for its current purposes, and that the official story was a convenience. "Where are we going?" she said quietly as they moved through an alley between the tanner's shop and a building with no windows that she had never identified. "I've got a place," he said. "Outside town, east side. We need to talk through this before we do anything." "You have a plan." "I have a direction," he said. "A plan requires more information than I currently have." "That's honest." "I try to be honest when it doesn't cost me anything," he said. "When it costs me something, I try to be honest too, but I don't always manage it." She thought that was probably the most accurate statement she had heard from anyone in Black Hollow. They cleared the last of the buildings, and the land opened up around them. Scrub grass and the occasional stand of cottonwoods along the dry creek beds, the town shrinking behind them into something that looked, from a distance, almost normal. She could feel the heat of the afternoon coming off the ground and the tired, plodding rhythm of the horse under them. "Tell me about the syndicate's building on Deacon Street," she said. He told her while they rode. She listened and asked questions. Some of the questions were specific. How many men on night watch, whether the front and back were both guarded, where the building stood relative to the others on the street, and some were more general, about the men who ran the operation and the way they operated and what they cared about most. Maddox answered what he knew and said plainly when he didn't know, which she appreciated. The place he'd set up was a dry stone structure that might have been a line shack at some point, positioned in a shallow draw that put it out of sight from the main track. There was a lean-to for the horse and a water barrel that was about a third full and a fire ring with cold ash in it. It was not comfortable. It was private. He dismounted first and held the horse while she got down, and she noticed he kept a certain careful distance. Not awkward about it, just deliberate, as if he had thought about it and decided on an approach. Inside the shack there was a bedroll, a pack, and a flat wooden crate that had been turned into a makeshift table. On the table were papers, hand-drawn maps, some notes in cramped writing, a few documents that looked like they might be copies of official filings. She looked at all of it. Then she pulled up the single three-legged stool and sat down and started reading. "You've been working on this a while," she said. 2 years, he said from the doorway. He had pulled out a knife and was doing something to a strip of leather from his saddlebag, which she thought might be a nervous habit. "Started as something else. Somebody hired me to deliver a message to a man in a town the syndicate controlled. And while I was there, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and when I tried to talk to anybody about it, I found out that everybody who should have cared about it had already been bought." "What did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. The knife worked along the leather. "They were moving people," he said. "Not the way they did today in the street. Nothing public. A group of them, maybe a dozen, in the back of a freight wagon. Settlers they'd run off their land with legal-sounding paperwork that wasn't legal. They'd taken the land and then they took the people, and they were moving them to another operation somewhere north." He paused. "There was a boy in the wagon, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. He was looking out from under the canvas and he looked right at me." She did not say anything. "I followed the wagon," he said. "That's how I started to understand how big this was." She went back to the papers on the table. Dates going back almost 2 years. Names, cross-referenced. Land parcel numbers. An organizational chart drawn in pencil, partly erased and redrawn, with circles and lines connecting them. "You can't take this to any law enforcement," she said. It was not a question. "Not in this territory. The marshal in Black Hollow is Calvin Pruitt, the auctioneer's brother. The territorial judge has holdings in 2 of the syndicate's land companies." He said it flat, without editorializing. "There's a federal circuit that comes through, but not until late fall, and the syndicate knows the schedule." "Federal," she said. "If we get documentation, real documentation, the kind that names names and shows transactions, there are federal investigators I can get it to. Men who aren't connected to this territory and who have been trying to build a case on the syndicate's operations elsewhere." He paused. "It needs to be enough that they can act on it. Not hints, not accusations. Proof." Eliza looked at the organizational chart. She looked at the names he had written in the outer ring of the structure. The visible men, the ranchers and merchants and lawmen. Then she looked at the center, where he had written a single name in a box and then crossed it out and written it again. "Harlow," she said. "Is that a person or the name of the operation?" "Both," he said. "There's a man named Warren Harlow. He doesn't live in Black Hollow. He's never here directly. Everything goes through intermediaries. But he's the one who built this and the one who runs it. Have you seen him? Once, a long time ago. He said it in a way that suggested there was more to that, and that he was not going to offer it, and she did not push. She looked at the papers for another long moment, then she stood up. My uncle's system, she said. He numbers his entries. He uses a date code that's not obvious. He offsets the year by 4, so something recorded in 1876 reads as 1872, and the month by 2 in the other direction. He thinks it's clever. She paused. If his ledgers are in that building, or if he handed over information that they incorporated into their own records, there will be entries that look slightly off. If I can get to them, I can identify them. Maddox was looking at her steadily. How do you know his system? Because I grew up watching him use it, and I have a good memory, she said. And because the summer I was 16 I was bored and I broke his cipher in an afternoon because I had nothing else to do. She met his eyes. It took him 3 days to figure out I had done it, and when he did, he made me swear not to tell anyone. I kept that promise. I don't feel obligated to keep it anymore. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, brief as a shadow. What's your read on the building on Deacon Street? She said. How many ways in and out? He moved to the table and pointed at one of the hand-drawn maps. She leaned in next to him, and they stood there in the hot, dim space of the line shack while the afternoon stretched out outside, and they started talking through it. What he knew, what he didn't, what they would need to find out before they could do anything, and how they might find it out without making it known that they were looking. It was not a plan. It was barely even a direction. But it was a start. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Eliza Vance felt something she did not immediately recognize because she had not felt it recently enough for it to be familiar. She was thinking. She was problem-solving. She was not a woman waiting for rescue or accommodation or mercy from people who had none to give. She was deciding. And that was different. That was something else entirely. Outside the draw, the sun was angling west. Black Hollow sat quiet in the distance, doing the thing that places built on the suffering of other people sometimes did, which was look perfectly ordinary from a certain angle. The main street with its hitching posts and its storefronts and its platform of rough-cut pine boards now empty. Tomorrow somebody would put something else up for auction on that platform. Eliza looked at the map and asked her next question. They worked through the maps until the light went bad. Maddox had a stub of candle he lit when the sun dropped below the draw's rim, and by its unsteady glow they went through what he knew about the Deacon Street building. Entry points, sight lines, the rotation of the 2 men the syndicate kept on watch there after dark. He had been watching the building for 3 weeks, which meant his information was reasonably current, but not guaranteed. Things changed. Men got moved around. New precautions got added when something made the organization nervous, and an auction that ended with Rhett Maddox outbidding one of their preferred clients was the kind of thing that might make them nervous. They'll know it was you by now, Eliza said. She was sitting on the crate with the map across her knees, tracking the street layout with her finger. Word travels fast in a place this size. They knew before the hammer came down, he said. Cutter or somebody like him sent a runner the minute I opened my mouth. So they'll be watching for you. They're always watching for me, he said, without particular drama. That part's not new. She looked at him across the candle. How have you stayed alive here for 3 weeks? I haven't been here the whole 3 weeks. I've been in and out. I've got a contact in town, a woman who runs the laundry on the north end. She passes information. He paused. And I'm careful. Your contact, does she know what you're doing? She knows enough, not everything. He picked up one of the papers from the table and studied it for a moment before setting it back down. Her name's Dora Finch. Her husband was a settler the syndicate ran off his land 2 years ago. He tried to fight the paperwork through official channels, and he had an accident. The word accident came out flat. The way you say a word when you want the listener to understand its full weight without having to qualify it. She's got 2 daughters. She stays in town because it's safer than trying to leave, and she passes me information because it's the only form of fighting back she's got access to. Eliza absorbed that. She thought about the woman, a stranger, someone she had never met, spending 2 years passing scraps of information to a man who might or might not do anything useful with them, all while running a laundry and keeping 2 daughters safe in a town that had killed her husband. She thought about what that cost, day after day, the maintenance of ordinary-looking life over the top of something that wanted to come apart. "We need to get into that building within the next 2 days," she said. Maddox looked at her. 2 days is fast. 2 days is before they decide to move the records somewhere I can't find them, she said. If they know you're in the area and they're worried about what you might do, the first thing they'll do is secure anything that could be used as evidence. That's what careful men do. She set the map down on the crate. My uncle was careful about his records until the moment he wasn't, and that moment cost him everything. Harlow's men aren't going to make the same mistake. He was quiet for a beat, looking at her. Not in an assessing way, or at least not only in an assessing way. There was something else in it, something she could not quite name. "You think like somebody who's had to plan around other people's bad decisions," he said. "I've been doing it since I was 14, she said. "You get efficient at it." He nodded slowly. He did not say anything sympathetic, and she did not want him to. 2 days, he said. "We'd need to know more about the building before we go in. Specifically, I need to know whether they changed the rear entrance. Dor told me last week that they had a new lock fitted, but she wasn't sure what kind. Can you get to her tomorrow?" "Maybe. Going into town myself is a risk." He thought about it. "She comes to the well on the North Road most mornings, early. If I'm in position before dawn, I can get there and back before the syndicate's men are moving around. And if they're already watching the well," he almost smiled, "then I'll have to be more careful than usual." She looked at the candle burning down between them. The flame wobbled in a draft from somewhere in the old wall and threw shadows around the inside of the shack that made everything look more provisional than it already was. She was tired in a way that sat behind her eyes and in the tendons of her hands, the kind of tired that comes from a long time of not feeling safe enough to properly rest. "I'll take the bedroll," Maddox said. "There's a blanket in the pack. It's not much." "I've slept with less," she said, which was true, though only recently. He blew out the candle and the dark came in around them, complete and western, the kind of dark that cities do not produce. Through the gaps in the old roof she could see stars, a dense scatter of them, more than she ever saw in Ohio, more than felt reasonable. She lay down and pulled the blanket around her and listened to him settle on the other side of the room, and she stayed awake longer than she wanted to, running through the building layout in her head, the date cipher, the names on the organizational chart, trying to find the shape of something she could not yet see clearly. At some point, she slept. Maddox was gone before she woke. He had left water in the tin cup by the crate and a piece of dried meat on top of the papers, which she ate sitting on the stool in the gray early light coming through the gaps in the walls, looking at the map with fresh eyes and finding 2 things she had not noticed the night before. The first was that Deacon Street ran parallel to the alley behind the livery stable, which meant there was a route to the rear of the building that did not require passing the front entrance or the intersection where the syndicate's men were most likely to be positioned. The second was that Maddox's notes listed a window on the building's eastern side as boarded, with a notation beside it that read, "Why board a window from the inside?" She stared at that notation for a while and thought about what it might mean, and why someone would want to keep light from getting out through a particular window rather than keep people from getting in. She was still thinking about it when she heard him coming back down into the draw, the horse picking its careful way over the loose stones of the bank. She had learned already to distinguish the sound of his approach from other sounds, which she noted as a thing that had happened without deliberate effort, the way useful adaptations sometimes did. He dismounted and tied the horse and came inside. He was moving normally, which she took to mean nothing had gone wrong. "Doris says the rear entrance has a new bolt," he said. "Iron fitted into the frame, not the door. Means you can't work it from outside with any standard tool." "So the rear entrance is out?" "Not necessarily." He sat down on the crate, she had moved to the stool, and picked up the map she had been looking at. "She also says there's been a lot of movement in and out of the building this past week, more than usual. Men she didn't recognize, carrying things in." "Carrying things in," Eliza said. "Not out." "Not out?" She looked at the notation about the boarded window. They're consolidating, she said. If they've been running operations across multiple locations and they're worried about exposure, they'd bring everything into one place, a place they control tightly. She tapped the eastern wall of the building on the map. Which means there might be more in there now than there was 3 weeks ago. More evidence, he said. More risk, she said. More people, more activity, more reason for someone to be in that building at odd hours. She looked at the map. But also, if they're bringing records in, they're moving them. People who are moving things from one place to another are not the same as people who are guarding a static location. They're busy. They're distracted. She paused. I need to see the building myself. He looked at her. In daylight. Not directly, but I need to walk the street and see it with my own eyes. The map is good, but it's not the same. You'd be recognized. Anybody from the auction. I was on that platform for less than 20 minutes, and most of the crowd was looking at the auctioneer or at you when you walked in. She said it without vanity, just accuracy. I had on a dark blue dress. I'd need something different. She paused. Does Dora Finch have access to clothing? He thought about it. He was doing the calculation she was doing, which was the ratio of what they needed against what could go wrong, and the fact that he did not immediately refuse told her he had landed in roughly the same place she had. I'll have to go back, he said. This afternoon, she said. Early enough that there's still enough movement in town that one more person isn't notable. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he picked up the map and folded it and put it inside his jacket. You're not cautious, he said. I'm very cautious, she said. Cautious and slow are not the same thing. He went back into town that afternoon and came back an hour before dark with a bundle of clothing from Dora Finch. A gray working dress, a bonnet, a light shawl that was worn but clean. He handed them over without commentary, and she changed in the shack while he waited outside. And when she came out, he looked at her for a moment in assessment. The bonnet pulls down far enough, she said. Far enough, he agreed. Not completely, was what he meant, but far enough was better than nothing. She had been managing distances between herself and what people expected for most of her life. She knew how to move through a space without inviting attention, how to angle herself, how to carry ordinary business in her posture, how to make herself the kind of unremarkable that people's eyes slide over because there is nothing there that signals anything interesting. Her mother had called it her invisible trick when she was small, though her mother had not meant it entirely as a compliment. They went in separately. Maddox went first by a longer route that kept him clear of the main street. Eliza came in from the North Road, walking with the particular purposeful pace of a woman going somewhere she goes regularly. She kept her eyes forward and her hands easy at her sides, and she walked down 3 streets before she turned onto Deacon. The building was the 4th one on the left. She had known which one from the map, but knowing from a drawing and seeing in person were different, and what she noticed first was how ordinary it looked. It was a 2-story structure, frame construction, painted a dark brown that had faded unevenly. The signage on the front said Harlow Land and Title Company in letters that had once been gilt and were now just worn gold paint. There was a small covered porch and a door that stood slightly open in the afternoon heat. She walked past it without slowing. She counted the windows, 2 on the ground floor facing the street, 1 on the 2nd floor. She could not see the eastern side from Deacon Street itself, but when she reached the intersection at the end of the block, she turned without hesitating and walked around the corner and down the side street, and from there she could see the eastern wall. The boarded window was on the 2nd floor. The boards were new. She could see the pale, unweathered wood against the darker exterior. There was a man leaning against the wall near the building's rear corner, doing nothing in particular. He had a rifle that he was not holding, but that was close enough to pick up. He was watching the alley without watching it hard, the way men watch things when they have been watching them for a long time and have gotten comfortable with nothing happening. She walked past him the way you walk past someone who is simply part of the street's furniture. She did not hurry. She did not look at him. At the end of the side street, she turned again and kept walking until she found the gap behind the livery that Maddox had marked on the map, and she went through it and came out on the parallel alley and found him waiting near a stack of old lumber. The boarded window is on the 2nd floor, she said quietly. New boards. There's one man on the east wall near the rear corner, rifle within reach, not paying close attention, but functional. One visible, he said. There may be another I haven't been able to place. The front door was open. They keep it open in the afternoon. Makes it look like a legitimate business conducting legitimate business. He glanced past her toward the livery. What's your read on the window? She had been thinking about the window. She told him what she thought, that the boards were new enough that whatever was in that room had been put there recently, which fit with the idea of consolidation, and that if they had gone to the trouble of boarding it from the inside rather than nailing boards over the outside, they were worried about someone with a lamp at night seeing light coming out rather than about someone getting in through the glass. It's where they're keeping the new material, she said. Whatever they brought in this week, they don't want it visible from outside. He looked at the building's general direction for a moment. Second floor, he said. That's harder. The livery has a loft, she said. The gap between the livery's east wall and the building's west wall. How wide is it? He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. 8 feet, maybe, he said. Maybe 9. From a loft to the building's second floor. What's the height difference? The building's taller. You're looking at going up, not across. Can you get to the building's second floor from outside at all? Not easily. There's no external stair. She thought about it. The interior stair, she said. Ground floor entry, move to the upper floor while the man on the east wall and whoever's inside are occupied with something else. Something else meaning what? Meaning a reason to be occupied. She paused. How many people does Dora Finch know in that building? He was still looking at her with that not quite surprise. She knows the man who runs their front office. Name's Aldous Webb. She's brought laundry to the building before. It was part of how she got me information. Can she get a message to Webb that there's a problem with an order? Something that requires him to come to the front of the building or outside? She paused. Not dangerous to her. Something routine. Maybe, he said carefully. Tomorrow night, she said. We go in tomorrow night. He was quiet for a moment. The alley was still around them, the late sun cutting a long stripe of light across the dirt. Somewhere in the livery a horse stamped once and went quiet. You decided all of this walking past the building, he said. I decided most of it looking at your map, she said. Walking past confirmed it. He took a slow breath and looked at the wall of the livery beside them. She could see him working through it, the angles, the timing, the things that could fail. And she waited while he did it because she had already worked through the same list and she was reasonably sure they had landed on the same conclusion. I'll talk to Dora tonight, he said. Don't go back into town tonight, she said. Write it down. She has daughters. She goes to the well in the morning. He looked at her for a second. Then he pulled a small folded piece of paper from his jacket, wrote 4 words on it in pencil, and handed it to her. She read it. The 4 words were enough. Dora Finch would understand. Keep the dress, he said, and the bonnet. You might need them again tomorrow. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. They went back to the shack separately, by different routes, and the town of Black Hollow settled into its evening around them, lit windows and lamp smoke, and the sound of the broken spur getting louder as the dark came on, all of it carrying on with its ordinary rhythms, while underneath those rhythms, something that had been running a long time without challenge was about to meet the first serious obstacle it had encountered. Neither of them said that out loud. It did not need saying. Dora Finch left the note under a loose stone at the base of the well post, which was the system Maddox had set up and which had worked without incident for 3 months. She left it early, before the town's usual morning movement, which meant she had read his 4 words and understood them and decided quickly, which told Eliza something about Dora Finch before they had ever met. The note came back with 2 words added in different handwriting, smaller and more careful. Webb. 7. She got to him, Maddox said. He was reading the note standing at the entrance to the draw, still holding the gray horse by the rein. 7 means 7 in the evening. Webb will come to the front of the building at 7 to settle a question about a laundry order. She'll keep him there as long as she can. How long is as long as she can? 10 minutes, maybe 15 if she works at it. We need 8, Eliza said. Maybe 10. He folded the note and burned it in the fire ring, which was habit. She had noticed he destroyed written things as a reflex. even things that were not particularly sensitive. It was the behavior of a man who had learned that anything left behind could be used against you. They spent the rest of the morning on the specific problem of the man on the east wall. He was the obstacle with the fewest good solutions. Dora's message to Webb would pull attention toward the front of the building, but the man at the rear corner was not Webb's responsibility. He was one of the syndicate's security, and security did not wander toward the front because a laundry woman had a question about collar starch. "I'll handle him," Maddox said. "Handle him how?" Quietly. She looked at him. He said it without heat, without elaboration, and she understood that this was the part of what he did that he was not going to explain, and that she did not need to approve of. "Don't kill him," she said. He looked at her. "He's a hired hand," she said. "He might not know half of what he's guarding. Don't kill him unless there's no other way." "I wasn't planning on it," he said, and then, more quietly, "I don't kill people unless there's no other way. I want you to know that." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had been watching him for 2 days, and the way a person operated in small things told you about the way they operated in large ones, and what she had seen was a man who was precise rather than excessive. "All right," she said. The day moved slowly. There was nothing to do but wait, and waiting was the part she was worst at. Her mind kept working the plan, finding edges to examine, turning the sequence over to look for the things she had missed. Maddox, by contrast, had the capacity to go still in a way that was almost physical, sitting with his back against the shack wall and his eyes half closed, and she could not tell if he was sleeping or thinking and did not ask. At one point, without planning to, she said, "How did you end up doing work for the syndicate in the first place?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I was younger and I needed money, and I didn't ask the right questions about where the money was coming from. Work was work." "When did that change?" "Gradually and then all at once," he said. "The way most things change." He paused. "There was a job I was sent on that I finished before I understood what it actually was. By the time I understood, there was nothing I could do about it except not take another one." She waited. "I've been trying to do something about it ever since," he said. "That's the whole of it." It was not the whole of it. She could tell from the way he said it that there were things missing from that account, specific things he had decided to leave out. She did not press. She had her own version of the same kind of story, the places where the narrative skipped over something she did not want to examine in daylight. They ate the last of the dried provisions around midday. The afternoon unrolled across the draw in silence, broken only by the horse and occasional wind. At 5 o'clock, she changed into the gray dress and bonnet. At 6, they left the shack. Black Hollow in the early evening had a particular texture, the working day letting out, the saloon pulling men off the street into its noise and light, the sky going amber and long over the flat land to the west. It was the hour when the town was most occupied with itself, which was the hour they wanted. They separated at the edge of town. Maddox went wide around to the south, taking a route that would bring him to the east wall of the Harlow building from the alley side. Eliza came in from the north, along the road she had walked the day before, and she moved through the early evening foot traffic with her eyes forward and her breathing even. She was frightened. She had been frightened since the morning, and she had done nothing to try to eliminate the fear, because the fear was appropriate, and elimination would only be a form of dishonesty with herself. What she had done was decide that the fear was not the most important thing she was feeling, which was different from not feeling it. She reached the livery on Deacon Street at 10 minutes before 7. The liveryman was finishing his evening rounds. She could hear him moving in the back, the scrape and knock of stall work. She went in through the side door that Maddox had described to her, the one that was never latched because the liveryman had broken the mechanism months ago and had not gotten around to fixing it, and she moved through the dimness toward the ladder to the loft at the back. The loft was full of hay and old equipment and the smell of dust and horses, and the small window at the loft's far end looked out onto the narrow gap between the livery and the back of the building next door. Not the Harlow building, which was one further along the alley, and from this angle she could see a slice of the street in the corner of the rear wall. She was not going in through the loft. That had been considered and rejected for the reasons Maddox had identified, and what she was doing here instead was watching. Her role was to go through the front while he brought the guard's attention elsewhere, using the gap in the building's watch that Dora's message to Webb would create. This was the plan. She checked the position of the sun. 7 minutes. Below the loft window, at the edge of the alley, she heard a sound that was brief and not repeated. She could not see what caused it. 4 minutes. The town clock, a substantial mechanism in the church at the end of Main Street that someone had hauled in from somewhere back east, struck 7. The sound carried in the cooling air. She climbed down from the loft, went out the side door, and walked directly to the front entrance of the Harlow Land and Title Company. The porch was empty. Through the open door, she could see the front office. 2 desks, a filing cabinet, a territorial map pinned to the wall. No one was at the desks. From further back in the building, muffled by distance and walls, she could hear voices. She went in. The front office smelled like paper and lamp oil. She moved through it quickly, not running, the particular controlled speed of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and she found the interior staircase at the back of the front room behind a door that was half open. The stair creaked on the second step. She shifted her weight to the outer edge of the tread, and it was quieter, and she went up that way, one hand on the wall, listening. The second floor was a narrow hall with 3 doors. 2 were standing open. She could see a cluttered storage space through one, an empty room through the other. The third door was closed. She went to the closed door and tried the handle. Locked. She had been told to expect this, and she had the thin blade Maddox had given her that morning, and it took her longer than she wanted. 40 seconds maybe, which felt like considerably longer, before something in the mechanism gave and the door swung inward. The room behind the boarded window was about what she had expected, and not entirely what she had expected. There were files, dozens of them, in wooden crates and stacked loose on a table that took up half the room. There were ledgers, the tall accounting kind with cloth-covered boards. There were papers that looked like legal documents, property filings, survey records. Someone had organized them partially and then apparently stopped mid-process, because half the crates were stacked neatly and the other half were open and disordered, as if whoever was working on the consolidation had been interrupted and not returned. She went to the ledgers first. There were 11 of them on the table. She opened the nearest one and ran her finger down the column of dates. The dates were not offset. These were the syndicate's own records, not her uncle's. She worked through the ledgers quickly, scanning for the date pattern her uncle used. The 4-year backward offset on the year, the 2-month forward push on the month. Second ledger, third, fourth. Not there. Fifth ledger. She opened it, and the date pattern was wrong by the exact amount that her uncle's cipher would produce if applied to the current year. She stopped and read the page more carefully. It was there. Gerald Vance's neat, careful handwriting in column 4 mixed into the syndicate's own record structure in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. The entries went back 14 months. Names, amounts, land parcel numbers, transaction dates that corresponded, once decoded, to specific events she could cross-reference in her memory. She needed the full ledger and at least 2 others. She looked at the size of them. Thick, heavy. Not something she could carry under one arm. She heard footsteps below, moving in the direction of the front office. She took the 5th ledger, closed it, and put it on the floor beside her feet. She went to the loose papers on the table and began sorting by hand, looking for property filings that matched the parcel numbers from the ledger. The footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase. She stopped sorting. Someone was coming up. More than one person. She could hear the difference in weight, the uneven rhythm of 2 sets of feet on the creaking treads. She looked at the door, which she had left open because closing it would have meant relocking it from inside, and she did not have a way to do that. She picked up the ledger and moved to the side of the door, pressing flat against the wall in the space where the door, if opened fully, would conceal her. It was not a good hiding place. It would hold for approximately 3 seconds if anyone came all the way into the room. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A voice said, "Did you leave that door open?" A second voice said, "What door?" "The office door on the right." A pause. She was holding herself completely still, the ledger pressed against her chest, the wall solid against her back. "I didn't leave it open," said the second voice, the sound of a slow step toward the doorway. She could see, through the gap between the door's edge and the frame, a partial slice of the hall. The far wall, a strip of floor. A shadow moved into that slice. Then, from downstairs and outside, from the direction of the front of the building, a sound. A voice raised, not quite shouting, but clear and sharp. The distinct sound of an argument beginning at volume. The shadow in the hall stopped. "That's Webb," said the second voice. "I can hear it's Webb." A beat. "What's he arguing about?" "How would I know?" Another pause. The shadow retreated slightly. Then the footsteps moved back toward the staircase and went down, faster than they had come up. She stood in the space behind the door for 3 seconds after the sound faded. Then she moved. She could not take the ledger out the front. There would be men at the front now, whatever Dora had managed to escalate into an audible argument. She went to the boarded window and examined it quickly. The boards were nailed from the inside, 4 of them, horizontal. The top 2 were nailed into the frame. The bottom 2 were nailed into the sill. She pried at the lowest board with the blade. The nails were new, but the wood of the sill was old, and on the 3rd attempt the board pulled away from the sill with a sound she felt more than heard. A separation of wood that was loud in the small room, but probably not loud past the floor. She pried the second board. The window frame underneath was standard. A single sash painted shut. She ran the blade around the edge and pushed up, and it moved, stiffly, about 4 inches. 4 inches was not enough. She pushed harder. The paint cracked along the top of the sash, and the window jerked up another 3 inches. 7 inches. Still not enough. From downstairs, the voices had gotten louder. She could hear Webb's voice distinctly now, high and agitated, and another voice she did not recognize, and Dora's voice somewhere under both of them, patient and persistent. She put her shoulder against the sash and pushed with her legs, and the window went up another 5 inches with a crack of old wood that she was certain was audible on the street. 12 inches. She exhaled, looked at the gap, looked at herself, and made a decision. She pushed the ledger through the gap first, angling it out until it dropped into the alley below. The sound it made on landing was not catastrophic. She pulled off the bonnet, put it through, and then put her head and one shoulder through the gap and stopped, because the fit was as tight as she had calculated and tighter than she had wanted. She exhaled everything she had and pulled herself through. The fall was 6 feet, less than she had expected, and she landed badly. 1 foot on the ledger, ankle turning under her, the other foot hitting the packed dirt of the alley in a way that jarred up her leg to the knee. She went down on one hand and caught herself. She was in the alley. The window above her was dark. The ledger was on the ground beside her hand. She picked it up and straightened and put her weight on the turned ankle, which complained loudly but held. Maddox materialized from the shadow at the alley's end, moving fast and quiet. He looked at her, looked at the window above, looked at the ledger. "You went through this window," he said. "The stairs were not available," she said. "Walk, don't run." They walked. She was limping, not badly, but noticeably, and she focused on not making it worse and on keeping her pace steady and on not looking back toward the building. Behind them, the voices at the front of the building continued for another 30 seconds and then went quiet. They were 2 blocks away before she let herself breathe properly. "What happened to the man on the east wall?" she said. "He's sitting against the building with a headache," Maddox said. "He'll be fine in an hour." "You didn't—" "I told you I wouldn't." She nodded. They kept walking. "Dora," she said, "she'll be fine. Webb arguing with a laundry woman is not a crisis. She has a reason for everything she said. She'll have a complaint ready and an apology for the noise, and Webb will be annoyed, and that'll be the end of it." "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," he said, "but Dora's been doing this for 2 years and she's still there. She knows how to manage Webb." The edge of town came up ahead of them. She shifted the ledger under her arm and kept pace. The ankle was manageable, painful but manageable, and manageable was enough. What she was carrying under her arm, 14 months of records, in her uncle's careful ciphered hand, integrated into the syndicate's own accounting structure, was enough to put names to every transaction, every land theft, every person moved like cargo through the frontier town of Black Hollow. It was not the only evidence they needed, but it was the kind of evidence that made other evidence legible, the key that turned a collection of disconnected facts into something that could be understood by people who had not been living inside it. She had it. They had gotten it out. The ankle would heal. She did not allow herself more than a moment on any of that before she started thinking about what came next. Because what came next was the part that frightened her more than the building had. Not the getting of the evidence, but the using of it. The going public with it in a town where the people with the most to lose were also the people with the most guns. But that was the next problem, and they were not at the next problem yet. The line shack was dark when they reached it. Maddox lit the candle, and she set the ledger on the table and sat down on the stool and let the ankle rest. And for a few minutes, neither of them said anything at all. She spent the first hour after they got back decoding the ledger by candlelight, working through her uncle's cipher with the methodical patience of someone who had taught herself the system a long time ago out of boredom and was now using it out of necessity. Maddox sat across from her and did not rush her. He had learned, in the past 2 days, that she worked better without commentary, and he occupied himself with cleaning his pistol and checking the horse and doing the small maintenance tasks of a man who spent most of his life outdoors and had developed a domestic instinct for the things that kept equipment and animals functional. The ankle had swollen. She was aware of it as a persistent complaint at the edge of her attention, manageable as long as she did not move suddenly, and she did not move suddenly. What the ledger showed, once decoded, was worse than what she had expected, and she had expected something bad. Her uncle had not simply handed over collateral and walked away from a debt. He had been an active participant in the syndicate's land acquisition operation for at least 14 months, flagging settlers who had weak legal documentation, identifying homesteads that were vulnerable to fraudulent survey challenges, and in 2 cases providing introductions that had allowed syndicate representatives to approach isolated farming families under the pretense of offering legitimate land purchase agreements. The money that came back to Gerald Vance was recorded in column 4 of the ledger, offset by his cipher, and it was not a small amount. She sat with that for a moment. Not with grief exactly. She had run out of surprise at her uncle some time ago, but with the particular cold feeling of confirmation. The thing you suspected turning out to be exactly as bad as you suspected, which is never actually satisfying. My uncle was not a bystander, she said. Maddox looked up from the pistol. He was a source for them, she said. He identified targets. He helped them find people to take advantage of. She turned the ledger toward him so he could see the columns, though he could not read the encoded dates without her translation. 14 months of it. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he said, "Does that change what you want to do?" "No," she said. "It changes what I think of him," which was already low. "It doesn't change anything about the syndicate." He nodded and went back to the pistol. She went back to the ledger. It took another hour to work through the full document and write a clean translation on the blank back pages of one of Maddox's maps, dates corrected, names fully written out. When she was done, she had a list of 47 transactions and the names attached to each one. Some of the names she recognized from Maddox's organizational chart. Some she recognized from her 3 weeks in Black Hollow. Several she recognized because they had been in the crowd at the auction, watching. "This is the evidence you need," she said. "Part of it," he said. "The ledger plus my documentation, the property filings I've been collecting, the survey records. That's enough for federal investigators to open a formal inquiry. That's enough to bring charges." He paused. "Getting it to the right people is the problem." "You said you had contacts." "I have one contact," he said. "A federal investigator named Carver. He's been trying to build a case on the syndicate's operations in 2 other territories. He's trustworthy. The problem is he's not in this territory. He's stationed 4 days' ride from here, assuming you push hard." "Then someone needs to ride 4 days." "Someone does," he said. He was looking at her in a way that told her the shape of what he was about to say before he said it. "The syndicate is going to know the ledger is missing by morning, if they don't know already. When they find the window and the pried boards, they'll understand what happened. They'll know it was me, and they'll assume I have what I came for." "They'll come after you," she said. "They'll come after both of us," he said. "You were at the auction. They'll know by now that you didn't go quietly with the man who bought you, and they'll have figured out that the man who bought you was not a random bidder." He set the cleaned pistol down on the crate. "If I ride for Carver, you're on your own for 4 days in a territory where they're actively looking for both of us. And if I ride for Carver," she said, "you're here alone." "I know this territory," he said. "I know where to be difficult to find. You don't have that same advantage." She looked at the translated notes in front of her, then at the ledger. If something happens to the ledger before it reaches your federal contact, none of this matters. I know. So we don't split up, she said. He thought about that. Writing together, we're more visible. Writing separately, one of us has the ledger and the other doesn't, and if the wrong one is caught... She stopped. We stay together. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to argue. Then he said, "There's another option, something I've been thinking about since this afternoon." She waited. "The town gathering," he said. "Every 2 weeks, the merchants and landholders have a meeting in the Broken Spur. It's a syndicate institution. They use it to keep their people coordinated, but it's also open to any property owner in the area because it looks better that way. Next gathering is in 2 days." "I'm aware of it," she said. "My uncle attended 2 of them." "If we could get into that meeting," he said slowly, "and present the ledger, the actual document, publicly, with the decoding explained on the spot where anyone who wanted to could see it, it changes the calculation entirely. You can't disappear evidence that 40 people have seen with their own eyes. You can't disappear 40 witnesses." He paused. "The syndicate's power in this town depends on people believing there are no alternatives to going along with them. If you break that belief publicly, in a room full of people who have a choice to make in the moment, some of those people are in the ledger," she said. "Some of them," he agreed, "but not all of them. And the ones who are not in the ledger have been living under the ones who are. Given a public moment to choose a side, some of them will choose the other one." She thought about it. It was not a clean plan. It was the kind of plan that had multiple points of failure and depended on human behavior in a pressured moment, which was the least predictable variable she could think of. But he was right about the math of public evidence. Information that existed only in a document could be seized and destroyed. Information that had been read aloud to a room full of people became something that lived in memory and testimony and spread the way fire spread, requiring every person who had heard it to be silenced rather than just one document to be confiscated. "They'll try to stop us before we finish," she said. "Yes." "The men in that room who are in the ledger will have men with guns." "Yes." "You'd be walking into a room where multiple people are going to want to kill you." "I've done worse for less," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite humor and not quite resignation, but occupied the space between them. She looked at him across the candle. 2 days ago, she had not known his name. She was aware of that in the same way she was aware of the ankle, a fact at the edge of attention, not the most important thing, but not nothing. "We need people on our side in that room," she said. "People who are not in the ledger and who have reason to turn against the syndicate if given the opportunity." "Dora," he said. "Dora, and whoever she trusts." Eliza paused. "And the women from the auction, the ones who were on the platform, they know what the syndicate does. If they're still in town and if they can be reached." "The woman with the split lip," he said. "She works in the laundry now. Dora knows her." Eliza nodded. "And the settlers in the surrounding area, the ones who have had land taken or who are afraid of having it taken. They don't come to the town meeting normally, but if they knew that something was going to happen at this one, you can't announce it," he said. "If word gets back to the syndicate that we're planning something..." "Not announced," she said. "Word passed quietly to specific people. Dora can do that. She knows who to trust." He looked at the ledger and the translated notes, and was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the same sequence she had already worked through, finding the same problems she had found, testing the same solutions. "It could still go wrong," he said. "Every part of this could go wrong," she said. "That's been true since the auction." He picked up the pistol from the crate and holstered it and stood up. He went to the doorway of the shack and looked out at the dark of the draw, and she let him look. She was tired in a way that the floor of the shack was not going to fix, but she was also something else, something that was closer to the way she had felt in the first conversation with him, the recognition of herself as someone acting rather than being acted upon. "There's something I need to tell you," he said from the doorway. She waited. "Warren Harlow, the man whose name is at the center of all of this." He did not turn around. "I told you I saw him once." "That was true. What I didn't tell you is the context." A pause. "He was the man who hired me for the job I mentioned, the one I finished before I understood what it was. He hired me directly. I met him in person. I spent an evening in a room with the man, and I shook his hand, and I took his money, and I went and did what he paid me to do." He stopped. "What I did on that job is something I can't undo. I can make it mean something, or I can just carry it. I've decided I'd rather make it mean something." She looked at his back in the doorway, at the tension in the line of his shoulders that he did not quite manage to eliminate even now. "I'm not going to ask you what the job was," she said. He was quiet. "It doesn't change the ledger," she said. "It doesn't change the 47 transactions. It doesn't change the people in this territory whose land was taken and whose family members were moved like freight." She paused. "What it changes is the reason you're here, and the reason seems adequate." He turned around then. In the candlelight, his face was difficult to read, but she had been reading it for 2 days, and she had gotten reasonably good at the effort. "You're either a very forgiving person," he said, "or a very practical one." "Practical," she said, without hesitation. "Forgiving takes time I don't currently have." Something shifted in his expression, that same, not quite smile that crossed his face occasionally and never fully arrived. They spent the next 2 hours working through the meeting plan with the same systematic attention they had given to the building on Deacon Street. Who would be in the room, where the exits were, how long it would take to read enough of the decoded ledger aloud that the content was in the room regardless of what happened after. What Maddox would need to do if the syndicate's men moved before she finished. There was a moment, somewhere in the second hour, where they were both leaning over the map and the translated notes on the makeshift table, and she became aware of how small the space was and how much it had become. In 2 days, a space she moved through without the constant low-level alertness of an unfamiliar place. She noted that and set it aside because it was not useful information at the moment. What was useful was this. By the time the candle burned down to its last inch, they had something that was closer to a plan than a direction. It was imperfect, with gaps she did not like and variables she could not control. But it had a logic to it, and the logic was sound. She slept for 4 hours. When she woke, Gray was starting at the gaps in the roof, and Maddox was already up, crouched by the fire ring making coffee from the small reserve he kept in his pack. He handed her a cup without being asked. She drank it and looked at the ledger on the table, and thought about the 60 or 70 people who would be in the Broken Spur in 2 days, and about the specific kind of courage required to say out loud, in a room full of dangerous men, a truth that everyone in the room already knew, but no one had yet been willing to say first. The coffee was terrible. She drank all of it. Outside the draw, the morning was beginning its usual indifference to human arrangements. The light coming up flat and broad across the land, the birds starting, the sky going from dark to a pale gray blue, Black Hollow sitting 2 miles to the west, proceeding with all the ordinary rhythms of a town that was not ordinary at all. "Dora needs to know today," Eliza said. "I'll get word to her this morning," Maddox said. "Tell her about the women from the auction, too. If the woman with the split lip is willing, I'll tell her everything." He paused. "Eliza." She looked at him. He had used her name exactly twice in 2 days, she realized. Both times when he was about to say something he had decided mattered. "In that room," he said, "once you start reading, you don't stop. No matter what happens on my end, you don't stop." She held his gaze. "I wasn't planning on stopping." "I know," he said. "I needed to say it anyway." She nodded once, and he nodded back, and that was the end of that conversation, and the beginning of the day that would run them toward the next one, toward the Broken Spur, and the room full of dangerous men, and the thing that needed to be said first before anyone else was willing to say it. The day of the gathering came in gray and close, the sky pressing down on Black Hollow like something that had not yet decided what it wanted to do. By mid-morning, there was a smell in the air that might have been rain coming from the north, though rain did not often follow through on its suggestions in this part of the territory. Eliza and Maddox rode in separately, as they had planned, coming at the town from different directions and arriving at intervals that would not suggest coordination to anyone watching. She came first, wearing the gray dress and bonnet, the ledger wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tucked inside a canvas bag. She carried on her arm like a woman going to market. The ankle had improved overnight, still tender when she put her full weight on it, but functional, and she walked without the limp that had marked her 2 nights ago in the alley. Dora Finch had done her work quietly and thoroughly. Over the past 2 days, through the particular network of women who did laundry and cleaning and cooking for the households of Black Hollow and therefore moved through it more or less invisibly, the word had gone out to specific people. Come to the Broken Spur tonight. Come and stay near the back. Be ready. Eliza did not know how many had received that word and how many of those had decided to act on it. That was the variable she could not control and had stopped trying to calculate. She arrived at the Broken Spur at 6:30. The gathering was set for 7. The saloon's main room had been arranged for the meeting in the way it was always arranged. The tables pushed back, chairs set in rough rows, a space at the front near the bar where the meeting's moderator would stand. The moderator was a man named Galt, a land broker who was not in the ledger but who was close enough to the syndicate's operation that his absence from the records was almost certainly a choice rather than an oversight. He was already there when she arrived, arranging papers on the bar top with the self-important efficiency of a man who liked running things. She took a chair toward the middle of the room, not the back. The back was where you sat if you were trying not to be noticed, and she needed a position from which her voice would carry. And she set the canvas bag on her lap and waited. People filed in over the next 30 minutes. She recognized faces. The gray-bearded rancher, whose name she now knew from the ledger was Aldred Coombs, came in with 2 other men she recognized as regular syndicate-connected figures. Webb from the Harlow Land Office arrived, looking somewhat drawn, and she thought he had probably not slept well since the evening Dora had kept him occupied in the street. 3 merchants she did not know by name took seats near the front. A woman came in and sat 2 chairs down from Eliza without looking at her, and Eliza recognized her from the platform, the one who had been holding the younger woman's sleeve. Her name, Dora had told her, was Ruth Carver, no relation to the federal investigator, and she worked now in the kitchen of the boarding house on the north end. Dora herself came in near 7 o'clock and stood near the wall to the left of the entrance, her hands folded in front of her, looking like a woman who had come to observe and had nothing particular on her mind. The room filled to perhaps 55 people. Eliza counted twice, from habit. Of those, she estimated that 8 to 10 were directly named in the ledger. Another dozen or so were the kind of adjacent that meant they knew and had benefited and had chosen not to know formally. The remainder were ordinary people, merchants, ranchers, settlers who had managed to hold their land so far, a few wives who had come with husbands, who were present because the gathering was nominally open and because this part of the territory had no other forum. Maddox was not in the room. She had not expected him yet. Galt called the meeting to order at 7:05, which was consistent with his established pattern of running slightly late in a way designed to suggest he was a busy man. He opened with the usual business: reports on road maintenance between Black Hollow and the eastern settlements, a dispute between 2 ranchers about a shared water source that the syndicate had been managing for its own purposes by keeping it unresolved, a discussion of the autumn supply schedule. She let it run for 12 minutes. She had decided on 12 minutes, long enough that the room was settled and attentive and past the restlessness of the opening, not so long that the evening's main business was done and people were starting to leave. At 12 minutes, she stood up. "I'd like to address the gathering," she said. The room turned. Galt looked at her with the expression of a man who has encountered an unexpected problem and is buying time to assess it. "The floor is for registered property holders," he said. "I don't believe I have your name." "My name is Eliza Vance," she said, clearly enough that the whole room heard it. "I was on the auction platform in this town 6 days ago. I think most of you know who I am." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something is about to happen that nobody is sure about. She could feel the quality of attention shift, from the distracted half-listening of a meeting in progress to something sharper and more wary. Coombs, the gray-bearded rancher, said from his seat near the front, "This is not the place for a—" "I have documentation," she said, and she reached into the canvas bag and took out the ledger and held it up so the room could see it. "This is a ledger from the Harlow Land and Title Company on Deacon Street. It contains 14 months of transactions relating to land acquisition, debt collection, labor placement, and the movement of persons in this territory. I am going to read from it." She opened to the first translated page and began. She read names, she read dates, she read amounts of money paid and received. She read land parcel numbers alongside the names of families who had once owned them and no longer did, and she read the names of the men who had benefited from those transfers. She read it steadily, at the pace of someone who was not going to be hurried, and she watched the room while she read. Coombs stood up at the third name. "That document is stolen property," he said. "Whatever is in it was obtained illegally and carries no—" "Sit down, Aldred." The voice came from near the back of the room. A man Eliza did not recognize, weathered, 60 or so, wearing the clothes of a working rancher rather than a prosperous one, had risen from his chair. He was looking at Coombs with the expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has finished being patient. "Let her finish," the man said. Coombs looked at him. The room looked at Coombs. Something passed through the air between them that was not words. It was the particular moment in a public space where the weight of numbers becomes visible to everyone present and everyone has to decide which side of the weight they are on. Coombs sat down. She kept reading. At the 7th entry, a man in the 3rd row, one of the merchants she had not known by name, stood up and walked toward the front of the room, and she tensed, but he did not come toward her. He went to Galt's position at the bar and said, in a voice that was quiet enough that she almost missed it, "I want to see that document." "You'll have the chance," she said. "Let me finish." She was on the 14th entry when the side door of the saloon opened. 2 men came in that she recognized as syndicate enforcers. She had seen both of them in various configurations over the past days, once near the Harlow building and once near the marshal's office. They were the kind of men who wore their purpose in their posture. The room registered them immediately. The first one looked at Eliza and said, "Put that down." "No," she said, and kept reading. He took 2 steps toward her and then stopped because Maddox had come through the main entrance behind the rows of chairs, and the room's attention split between them the way a river splits around an obstacle, and the enforcer looked at Maddox and recalculated visibly. "Don't," Maddox said. It was addressed to both of them, and it was quiet enough that it did not sound like a threat, and was one anyway. The second enforcer had his hand near his holster. The man who had told Coombs to sit down, the weathered rancher, had also stood up again, and he was not alone. 3 other men had risen around him, none of them drawing anything, all of them simply standing, which in a room this size meant something specific, and everyone knew what it meant. Eliza kept reading. She read 12 more entries. She read Webb's name attached to 3 of them, and Webb sat in his chair and looked at the floor and did not move. She read Coombs' name attached to 7 of the larger transactions, and Coombs gripped the back of the chair in front of him and said nothing. She read her uncle's name, Gerald Vance, participation beginning 14 months prior, commission on 6 identified transactions, and said it without hesitation and without particular emotion because it was a fact and facts did not require her feelings to be true. When she finished reading, she closed the ledger and looked at the room. "There are copies of this translation," she said, which was not entirely true. There was 1 additional copy that she had made by hand the previous evening. "And this document and its contents have already been communicated to a federal investigator." That part was true. Maddox had sent a writer the previous morning, a young man Dora trusted, with a letter to Carver containing the key decoded entries and a request for urgent attention. Whether Carver would act quickly enough to matter was still unknown, but the statement was accurate as far as it went. She set the ledger on the nearest table. "Anyone who wants to examine it may do so." For a moment the room held its breath. Then the merchant who had walked to the bar moved to the table and picked up the ledger, and the weathered rancher moved toward it, and Ruth Carver from 2 chairs down stood up and came to look, and then 3 more people, and then it was not a single movement but a general one, and the quality of the room changed irrevocably in the way that things change when enough people decide simultaneously that the arrangement they have been living under is finished. The 2 enforcers looked at each other. Maddox was watching them from the back of the room with his hands easy at his sides, not drawing, not threatening, simply present in the specific way that made the calculation obvious. One of them, the first one, the one who had told her to put it down, turned and went back out the side door without speaking. The second one stood for another moment and then followed. Galt had not moved from behind the bar. He was looking at the ledger making its way through the hands of the people he had been moderating for 2 years. And his face had the expression of a man watching something he cannot stop, and has just understood he cannot stop. "What happens now?" he said, to no one in particular. "Now the Federal Circuit gets involved," Maddox said from the back, "and the people in that ledger answer for what's in it." "The circuit's not due until fall," said someone near the front. "It's been moved up," Maddox said. That was also something Dora had helped arrange. A message through a contact she had outside the territory. A request to the circuit's scheduling office citing evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise. Whether it would result in an accelerated visit was not guaranteed, but the request had been made and the grounds were legitimate. The room did not transform in that moment into something orderly and resolved. That is not how rooms full of complicated people work. What it did was begin the process of transformation. The first tentative arguments between men who had been on the same side a half hour ago and were now recalibrating. The first questions addressed to Eliza about specific entries in the ledger. The first person who walked out of the Broken Spur that evening to go home and start figuring out what they were going to do when the accounting finally arrived. Coombs left early with his 2 associates, and nobody stopped him because stopping him physically in a crowded room was not the moment for that, and because he was not going anywhere that would matter. His name was in the ledger. His land transactions were documented. The territory was large, but the documentation was specific, and specific documentation had a way of traveling faster than a man on horseback could outrun. Dora Finch stayed until almost everyone else had left. When the room had thinned to a dozen people, she came to where Eliza was standing near the table and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "My husband's name was Thomas," she said finally. "I know," Eliza said. Maddox had told her that first night. "His land parcel is in there," Dora said. "Number 41. "I saw it," Eliza said. "It's documented. The transfer was fraudulent. That's recoverable. The kind of transaction that federal land court can reverse if the documentation is sufficient. And the documentation is sufficient." Dora looked at the ledger on the table. She did not cry. She had the look of a woman who had done her crying some time ago and had since converted it into something more durable. "My daughters have never seen that land," she said. "They were born after." A pause. "I'd like them to see it." "They will," Eliza said. And she meant it, not as reassurance, but as the thing she was going to work to make true. The federal investigators arrived in Black Hollow 31 days later, not through the accelerated circuit, but through a direct appointment, Carver himself, with 2 colleagues and a territorial marshal from outside the region who had not been bought by the people he was investigating. The letter Maddox had sent had been enough to establish urgency, and the ledger, which had been delivered to Carver by the young writer Dora trusted, and which had arrived intact, had been enough to establish cause. The arrest took place over 3 days. Coombs was found at a ranch east of town and came without significant resistance, which surprised some people and did not surprise Eliza, who had noticed in the ledger that he was a man who ran on the confidence of institutional protection and had very little to fall back on once that protection was removed. Webb was arrested at the Harlow building, which had been shuttered since the night of the gathering, and he cooperated with investigators almost immediately, which also did not surprise her. Gerald Vance was found in a town 2 territories north, which was not as far as he could have gone, and suggested he had not moved with great urgency, which was consistent with his general approach to consequences. He was brought back to answer for his role in the syndicate's operations. Eliza gave a written statement to Carver's investigators regarding her uncle's cipher system and its use in the ledger records. She did not attend any of the subsequent legal proceedings. She had given what was needed and did not feel compelled to do more than that. Warren Harlow himself was not in Black Hollow. He was, Carver explained to Maddox during the investigation, a man who existed at a careful remove from the operations he controlled, and building a case against him directly would require additional work and additional time. But it was being built. The ledger and the associated records were being cross-referenced against similar documentation from 2 other territories where the syndicate had been operating, and the picture that was emerging was large enough and specific enough that Harlow's removal from the scene would not protect him indefinitely. That was not justice completed. Eliza understood that, and she made herself understand it clearly, rather than softening it into something more satisfying than it was. Warren Harlow would answer eventually, or he would not, and the machinery of that outcome was now in motion and largely outside her control. What was inside her control was what she did with the time between now and whenever that resolution arrived. She stayed in Black Hollow. That surprised people, including, initially, herself. She had imagined leaving while had spent the first weeks after the gathering planning it in a vague way, turning over the question of where she might go and what she might do. But the land reclamation process was complicated and slow, and the people trying to navigate it needed someone who understood the documentation structure and could help them identify which transfers were fraudulent and which were not, and what evidence was required to make the case to the land court. Eliza understood that better than anyone else in the territory. She set up a small office in a room above the dry goods store. It was not a law office. She was not a lawyer and had no pretense of being one. But it was a place where settlers could bring their paperwork and sit down with someone who would read it carefully and tell them honestly what it said and what it might mean. She did not charge for this. She had no money to charge for it, and the people who came to her mostly had no money to pay. The owner of the dry goods store, a cautious man named Pell, who had been on the fringes of the syndicate's sphere without being inside it, let her use the room in exchange for help with his inventory records, which she organized in an afternoon. Dora Finch's daughters did see the land. The Thomas Finch homestead was one of the first transfers to be formally reversed by the federal land court, because the documentation in the ledger was unusually complete and Carver had prioritized it. Dora moved out there in October with her girls and most of what she owned, and a neighbor who had agreed to help her rebuild the structure that had been left to deteriorate after her husband's death. The auction platform was torn down in the third week after the gathering, not by any official order, but because a group of men, some of whom Eliza recognized from the room that night, showed up one morning with tools and took it apart and stacked the lumber in the alley behind the feed store. Nobody organized it. Nobody declared it. It simply happened, the way some necessary things happen, through the collective decision of people who have decided that a particular thing should no longer exist. Maddox stayed through the investigation and left a week after the last arrest. He did not announce his departure. He came to the room above the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning while she was working through a stack of property filings and told her he was leaving. She set the filings down. "Carver still needs you," she said. "Carver has what he needs from me," he said. "The rest of it is lawyers and paperwork, and I'm not useful in either of those." She looked at him for a moment. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was a thing he did when he was uncomfortable, a rare enough occurrence that it was notable when it happened. "Where will you go?" she said. "There are 2 other territories where I have information on syndicate operations," he said. "Carver can use it, but someone needs to gather it into something workable first." "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "Until it's done," he said. "Or until I can't." She nodded. That was the honest version of his future, and she appreciated that he did not dress it as something else. "The boy in the wagon," she said. "The one you told me about, the 8-year-old. He looked at her. "Did Carver's investigation find any of them?" she said. "The people who were moved." "Some," he said. "Not all." He said it the way you say something that you carry and have decided to keep carrying rather than set down. She stood up from the desk and crossed to the doorway where he was standing and held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, a brief, unguarded second where she could see the thing he did not usually let people see. And then he took it. His hand was exactly as scarred as she remembered from that first day in the back room of the feed store. "Don't get killed doing this," she said. "I'll do my best," he said, which was not a promise, and both of them knew it, and that was honest too. He left Black Hollow that afternoon. She watched from the window above the dry goods store as he rode south, the gray horse moving at a steady pace across the flat land beyond the last of the buildings. And then the land took him, and there was only the ordinary view of the territory in the late season light, wide and indifferent and open. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, and then she went back to the desk and picked up the property filings and continued working. There is something about watching a corrupt system fall that people tend to describe as triumphant, and the honest version is more complicated than that. The syndicate's dissolution did not happen all at once, and it did not happen cleanly. Some of the men who had been adjacent to it slid away into legitimate operations without significant consequence, because the law is a mechanism, and mechanisms have gaps. Some of the land that had been taken could not be recovered because the families who had held it had scattered too far and the thread back to them was too thin. Some people who deserved accountability did not receive it in any form that felt proportionate. That is the actual shape of justice when you get close enough to see it. Not a clean line, but a jagged one, with sections that hold and sections that don't, and work that has to continue past the moment that felt like the ending. What Eliza Vance knew, by the time the first winter settled over Black Hollow, was that she had started from a platform in the middle of a street where she had been sold, and she had ended up in a room where people brought her their most important documents and trusted her to read them accurately. She had not planned that destination. She had not planned most of what had gotten her there. What she had done was think clearly in the middle of things that were trying to stop her from thinking and make decisions that kept her moving forward instead of accepting the one that had been made for her. Her mother used to say that the difference between a hard life and an unbearable one was whether you kept your own counsel. Eliza had not understood that when she was young. She understood it now. Outside the window, Black Hollow was changing, slowly, unevenly, with the friction and backsliding that attends any place trying to become something other than what it has been. The auction ground was a bare patch of packed earth now, nothing growing there yet, the soil too compacted for easy recovery. But it was just ground that had held something ugly and now held nothing, which was the necessary first condition for holding something else. That was enough for now. Enough to keep working. Enough to keep going. Eliza picked up the next filing and read the first line and found her place.